The sound of Shaquille O'Neal's deep voice breaking with emotion echoed through the quiet studio, like thunder rolling across a peaceful valley on a summer evening that changes everything. You could feel the weight of years, the heaviness of untold stories that had been carried in silence, pressing against his massive chest as he sat in that oversized leather chair, looking smaller somehow than his 7-foot-1-inch frame should have allowed in any earthly dimension. The very air in the studio seemed to vibrate with anticipation, thick with the kind of emotional electricity that makes your skin tingle and your heart beat just a little faster, as if your body instinctively knows it's about to witness something that will be remembered long after the cameras stop rolling and the lights fade to black. "You know," Shaq began, his voice carrying a texture that few people had ever heard from the normally jovial giant who commanded respect and laughter wherever he went. "There are moments in your life that change absolutely everything. Moments when someone says something so simple, so pure, so fundamentally true that it reaches into your soul and rearranges everything you thought you knew about being a man, about being a father, about what it really means to believe in another human being." James Wilson, the veteran sports journalist conducting the interview, leaned forward slightly in his chair, his experienced eyes recognizing the signs of someone about to share something extraordinary. In 25 years of covering professional basketball, from locker room celebrations to tearful press conferences, he had developed an almost supernatural instinct for recognizing when something monumental was about to be revealed. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the large windows of the Atlanta studio, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with the emotional energy filling every corner of the room. Each beam of light appeared to carry its own weight, its own significance, as if the universe itself was creating the perfect atmosphere for words that would soon travel through television screens and computer monitors to touch millions of hearts across America and beyond. Robert Kim, the seasoned producer with 40 years in television, adjusted his headphones and signaled quietly to his camera operators. His weathered hands, which had guided countless interviews through decades of broadcasting, trembled slightly as he recognized the signs of something historic about to unfold. The technical crew moved with the reverence of people who understood they were about to document a moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and remembered for generations. "It was 3 years ago," Shaq continued, his massive hands clasping and unclasping as if he were trying to hold on to something precious and fragile, something that might disappear if he didn't grip it tightly enough. "Dell Curry and I were at a charity event in Charlotte. You know how these things usually go. Bunch of former players, current stars, everyone putting on their best face, trying to raise money for a good cause, making small talk about the old days. You can sense that powerful truths require courage to be spoken. And Shaq was gathering that courage with every breath he took, every pause he allowed, every moment he spent looking back through the corridors of memory to that night in Charlotte that had changed his entire understanding of what it means to be a father. The studio seemed to shrink around his presence, not because of his imposing physical size, but because of the emotional magnitude of what he was preparing to share. The very walls appeared to lean in, as if they too were eager to hear words that would soon echo through homes and hearts across the nation. Anthony Zhang, the experienced cameraman with 3 decades behind the lens, instinctively adjusted his focus. His trained eye had learned to recognize those sacred moments when history was about to be made, when something said in a television studio would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that would reach shores he couldn't even imagine. The event was held at this beautiful hotel ballroom, Shaq said, his voice growing softer, more intimate, like he was sharing a secret with his closest friend, rather than speaking to millions of viewers. Crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling, round tables covered in white linen, the whole elegant setup. But you know, what? None of that mattered once Dell and I started talking. The mention of Dell Curry's name seemed to shift something fundamental in the atmosphere of the studio. Everyone present knew Dell as Steph Curry's father, the former NBA sharpshooter who had carved out a solid 15-year career in the league. But tonight, Shaq was about to reveal Dell as something much more profound, a father whose words could move mountains, change lives, and transform the very understanding of what unconditional love looks like in action. Tyler Brooks, the young production assistant fresh out of college, felt goosebumps rising on his arms like tiny soldiers standing at attention. There was something about the way Shaq's voice had changed, something vulnerable and raw that made everyone in the room unconsciously lean forward, as if drawn by an invisible force toward the truth that was about to be revealed. We ended up sitting together during dinner, Shaq continued, his eyes growing distant as if he were being transported back to that night in Charlotte, back to a moment that had become a turning point in his life. Dell's quiet, you know. Not like me at all. I'm loud. I take up space. I demand attention wherever I go. But Dell has this calm about him, this peaceful presence that makes you want to stop talking and start listening. Connor Smith, a sports reporter watching the live stream from his cramped apartment in New York, paused his dinner preparations entirely. Something in Shaq's tone, something in the way he was choosing his words so carefully, made him understand that this wasn't just another feel-good story about former players reminiscing. This was going to be something that would resonate far beyond the basketball world, something that would touch the universal experience of family, of fatherhood, of believing in dreams that seem impossible. "So we're making small talk at first, right?" Shaq continued, his massive frame seeming to relax slightly as he settled into the memory. Talking about the old days, sharing stories about games we'd played, teammates we'd known, coaches who had driven us crazy. Normal stuff that happens when old players get together. But then, someone at our table, I think it was Marcus Williams, the former Hawks guard, mentions Steph and his incredible season that year. How many times in life do casual conversations turn into moments that reshape your entire perspective on everything you thought you knew? Shaq paused, allowing the weight of that question to settle over everyone listening like morning dew settling on grass, each drop carrying its own significance. Wilson could see the emotion building behind Shaq's eyes like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon, promising something powerful and transformative. The veteran journalist had learned over the years that the most important stories often began with the most ordinary circumstances. A dinner conversation, a chance meeting, a moment when someone decided to share their truth. And Dell's face just lit up, Shaq said, a small but genuine smile breaking through the serious expression that had dominated his features since the interview began. Not with simple pride, though there was plenty of that radiating from every part of him, but with something deeper, something that made me realize I was about to learn something important about what it really means to be a father, about what unconditional love looks like when it's lived out day after day, year after year. The lighting in the studio seemed to shift subtly, as if responding to the emotional temperature of the room. Robert Kim noticed it too. The way the afternoon sun streaming through the windows had taken on a golden quality that made everything appear more significant, more sacred, as if nature itself was preparing the stage for words that would soon matter to millions of people. Dell looked at me with these eyes, Shaq continued, his voice barely above a whisper now, creating an intimacy that drew everyone closer. And he said, "Shaq, can I tell you something about Steph that might surprise you? Something that most people don't know? Something that I've never really talked about publicly before?" Ryan Johnson, the audio engineer with 15 years of experience capturing every nuance of human emotion through sound, made micro-adjustments to his equipment. He understood that the most powerful moments were often the quietest ones, and he didn't want to miss a single inflection, a single breath, a single pause that might carry meaning beyond words. "And I'm thinking to myself," Shaq said, his voice rising slightly with remembered curiosity, "what could possibly surprise me about Steph Curry? I've watched this kid revolutionize basketball, break records that seemed unbreakable, win championships, change the entire mathematics of the game. What could his father tell me that I didn't already know? What secrets could there be about someone whose life has been so public, so documented, so celebrated?" The silence that followed was different from any other silence in that studio. It was the kind of silence that precedes revelations, the kind that makes you hold your breath because you sense that the next word spoken will echo through your memory for years to come, the kind that transforms ordinary moments into extraordinary ones simply by existing in the space between heartbeats. Daniel Patel, a veteran sports journalist watching from his home office in Miami, minimized all his other browser windows. Something about this interview had captured his complete attention in a way that few things could anymore. In 20 years of covering professional athletics, he had developed a sixth sense for when something truly important was about to be shared. But then, Dell said something that stopped me completely cold, Shaq said, his voice gaining intensity while somehow becoming even more gentle, creating a paradox that seemed to embody the complexity of the emotions he was experiencing. He said, "Shaq, there were years when absolutely everyone told Steph he'd never make it to the NBA. Coaches, scouts, even some family friends who meant well. They said he was too small, too skinny, too soft for professional basketball." You could see the emotional impact of those words washing over Shaq's face like waves against a shoreline, each revelation carving new channels of understanding through his consciousness. His massive frame seemed to deflate slightly, as if the weight of Dell's words was physically affecting him all over again, bringing back the full force of that conversation from 3 years ago. "And I'm sitting there at this fancy dinner," Shaq continued, his voice filled with disbelief that remained fresh even after all this time, thinking, how is this even possible? This is Steph Curry we're talking about. The kid who changed everything about basketball. The kid who made impossible shots look routine. Who turned 40-foot three-pointers into high-percentage shots. How could anyone have doubted him? How could anyone have looked at that talent and seen limitation instead of limitless possibility? Christopher Lee, a former NBA analyst watching from his study in Boston, felt his own breath catch as he recognized the universal truth Shaq was approaching. Every great success story, he realized, probably began with someone being told they weren't good enough, weren't built right, weren't destined for greatness. But then Shaq's expression changed completely, dramatically. The disbelief gave way to something much deeper, something that looked like the beginning of understanding mixed with profound respect and a dawning realization that he was about to learn something that would change his life forever. "That's when Dell looked me straight in the eyes," Shaq said, his voice now carrying the weight of a confession that had been years in the making, and said the words that would change absolutely everything I thought I knew about being a father, about believing in your children, about never giving up on the people you love most in this world. The camera captured the exact moment when Shaq's eyes began to glisten with unshed tears, creating an image that no one in that studio, and soon no one watching at home, would ever be able to forget. It was the sight of one of the most dominant forces in basketball history being moved to tears by the memory of another father's love for his son. Kevin O'Connor, the veteran sound engineer, checked his levels one more time. Something told him that whatever Shaq was about to reveal would require the most careful, most respectful handling his equipment and expertise could provide. The weight of the moment seemed to press down on everyone in the studio like a physical force. What could Dell Curry have possibly said that would affect someone like Shaquille O'Neal so profoundly? A man who had dominated basketball courts across the globe, who had commanded respect and fear from opponents, who had seemed unshakable in his confidence and larger-than-life personality. What words could reach through all that success and strength to touch something so fundamental, so human, so vulnerable? The answer was coming, building like a crescendo in a symphony that had been playing for 3 years in Shaq's heart and mind, waiting for the right moment, the right audience, the right opportunity to be shared with a world that desperately needed to hear about the power of a father's unwavering belief in his child's impossible dreams. Powerful truths require courage to be spoken, and sometimes they require even more courage to hear and accept, especially when they force us to examine our own hearts, our own relationships, our own capacity to believe in miracles that haven't happened yet, but could, with the right encouragement, with the right support, with the right person refusing to let us give up on ourselves. Shaquille O'Neal took a deep breath that seemed to fill the entire studio with anticipation, like the moment before a symphony begins when every instrument is poised and ready, when the conductor's baton is raised, when the audience collectively holds its breath knowing that something beautiful and transformative is about to unfold. You could feel the emotional weight settling over his massive shoulders like a heavy blanket made of memories, revelations, and the profound responsibility of sharing words that had fundamentally changed his understanding of what it means to love another human being unconditionally. Dell looked at me with those calm, steady eyes. Shaq continued, his voice gaining a reverence that transformed the studio into something resembling a sacred space, a confessional where truth was about to be spoken with the kind of courage that changes lives. And he said something that I've never forgotten, something that I think about every single day, something that changed the way I talk to my own children, the way I see my role as a father, the way I understand what it really means to believe in someone when the whole world is telling them to give up. James Wilson felt his pulse quicken as he realized they were approaching the emotional heart of something extraordinary, something that would resonate far beyond the confines of this television studio and touch lives in ways they couldn't even imagine. In his quarter-century of conducting interviews, from post-game celebrations to retirement announcements, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was about to reveal something that would echo through history. The afternoon light streaming through the windows seemed to grow softer, more golden, more deliberately beautiful, as if the universe itself was creating the perfect atmosphere for words that would soon travel through fiber optic cables and satellite signals to reach into homes and hearts across America and around the world, carrying with them the power to transform relationships and redefine what families could become. Dell leaned closer to me across that dinner table, Shaq said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow carried more power than any shout ever could, creating an intimacy that made millions of future viewers feel like they were part of that private conversation in Charlotte 3 years ago. And he said, "Shaq, when Steph was 16 years old, just a sophomore in high school, after another coach told him he'd never make it past high school basketball, he came home that night completely devastated. Not just sad or disappointed, absolutely broken, like his entire world had collapsed around him." You can sense how deeply these words affected Shaq even now, years later, as he relived that moment in Charlotte when Dell's story had first shattered his assumptions about success, about struggle, about the hidden battles that every great achievement represents. His massive hands that had dominated basketball courts around the world, trembled slightly as they rested on his knees, creating a stark visual reminder of how vulnerability can affect even the strongest among us. Robert Kim, the veteran producer, signaled quietly to his camera operators with the subtle hand gestures of someone who had spent 40 years recognizing historic moments. He knew they were capturing something special, something that would be replayed and remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling, something that would find its way into documentaries and inspirational speeches for decades to come. Dell told me that Steph sat in their kitchen that night, Shaq continued, his voice thick with emotion as he painted the scene with words, at the same table where he'd eaten breakfast every morning since he was a little boy, surrounded by all the familiar things that should have made him feel safe. But instead of feeling safe, he felt completely defeated. And he looked at his father with tears streaming down his face and said, "Dad, maybe everyone's right about me. Maybe I'm just not good enough. Maybe I should just give up on this dream that's causing me so much pain." The silence that followed those words was deafening, filled with the weight of every parent who had ever faced that moment when their child's dreams seemed to be crashing down around them, when the world's harsh realities threatened to extinguish the light of hope that had burned so brightly in young hearts. How many mothers and fathers have had to find the perfect words to rebuild their child's shattered confidence? How many families have stood at that crossroads where dreams either die or find new life through the power of unwavering belief? Anthony Zhang adjusted his camera angle slightly, capturing the play of emotions across Shaq's face with the skill of someone who had spent 30 years documenting the full spectrum of human experience. In 3 decades behind the lens, he had learned that sometimes the most powerful stories were told not just through words, but through the expressions of people brave enough to be completely vulnerable in front of millions of strangers. And that's when Dell said the words that absolutely broke me, Shaq said, his voice now carrying a quality that made everyone in the studio lean forward unconsciously, drawn by the magnetic force of truth being spoken with complete authenticity. He told me, "Shaq, I looked at my 16-year-old son sitting there in our kitchen, and I realized that this was one of those moments that would define not just his future, but the kind of father I was going to be. So I said to him, Steph, the world doesn't get to decide your worth. The world doesn't get to determine your destiny. The only opinion that truly matters is the one you have of yourself, and the faith we have in you as a family who loves you unconditionally." Tyler Brooks felt goosebumps rising on his arms like a wave of electricity, spreading from his shoulders down to his fingertips. Those weren't just words about basketball or career aspirations. They were words about life, about self-worth, about believing in yourself when absolutely nobody else will, about the transformative power of unconditional love and support that refuses to be shaken by external circumstances. But Dell wasn't finished with what he told Steph that night, Shaq continued, and you could see tears beginning to form in his eyes like morning dew on grass, each drop reflecting the studio lights like tiny prisms of emotion. He told Steph, "Son, I've watched you in that backyard for hours every single day since you were 8 years old. I've seen your dedication when nobody was watching, your heart when shots weren't falling, your refusal to quit even when everything seemed hopeless. The world sees a small kid who might not make it. I see a giant who hasn't grown into his power yet." Connor Smith, watching from his apartment in New York, had to pause the stream and wipe his own eyes. There was something about hearing these words through Shaq's emotional retelling that made them feel deeply personal, universal, like a message that every person needed to hear from someone who believed in them completely, regardless of what the rest of the world might think or say. "Dell looked at me across that dinner table in Charlotte," Shaq said, his voice breaking slightly as he continued to share this sacred memory. "And he said, I told Steph that night that I would rather have a son who chased impossible dreams with everything he had than a son who settled for what others thought was realistic. I told him that believing in yourself isn't arrogance when it's backed up by hard work and dedication. It's survival. It's the only way to make it through a world that's constantly trying to convince you to accept limitations that don't really exist. Powerful truths require courage to be spoken, and Dell Curry had found that courage when his son needed it most, in a kitchen in Charlotte on a night when the future seemed uncertain and dreams seemed fragile. But Shaq was discovering that hearing those truths years later required its own kind of courage. The courage to examine his own parenting, his own words, his own capacity to be the kind of believing voice that could change a life. And then Dell told me the part that completely destroyed me, Shaq said, now openly emotional, his voice thick with tears that he was no longer trying to hide. He said, "Shaq, I made Steph a promise that night that I've kept every single day since. I promised him that no matter how many people doubted him, no matter how many doors got slammed in his face, no matter how many times the world tried to convince him he wasn't good enough, he would always have one person who believed in him completely. One person who saw his greatness even when he couldn't see it himself." James Wilson felt his own throat tightening with emotion as he realized that this wasn't just a story about Steph Curry's journey to the NBA. This was a master class in fatherhood, in the power of unwavering belief, in the kind of love that can literally alter the trajectory of a human life and create ripple effects that extend far beyond anything we can imagine. "Dell looked me straight in the eyes," Shaq continued, his massive frame trembling with the weight of the memory, "and said, I told Steph that every great person in history was once somebody that somebody else believed in when believing seemed impossible. I told him that his job wasn't to prove the doubters wrong. His job was to prove himself right. His job was to become the person he was meant to be, regardless of what anyone else thought was possible." Ryan Johnson, the audio engineer, made micro-adjustments to ensure every nuance of Shaq's emotional delivery was captured perfectly. He understood that these weren't just words being recorded for a television show. They were becoming part of something that would inspire parents and children for generations to come, something that would be quoted in graduation speeches and shared at kitchen tables across the country. "But the part that hit me the hardest," Shaq said, his voice now barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying the weight of the world, "was when Dell told me about the next morning after that difficult conversation. He said Steph came down to breakfast, walked right up to him, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "Dad, I'm going to make you proud. I'm going to show the world what happens when someone refuses to stop believing in their dreams, no matter how impossible they seem." How is it possible that words spoken years ago in a kitchen in Charlotte could have such profound impact on someone like Shaquille O'Neal, a man who had achieved everything basketball had to offer? But there he was, this giant of a man, this dominant force who had commanded respect on every basketball court he'd ever stepped, foot on, reduced to tears by the memory of a father's unwavering love and belief in his son's potential. "Dell smiled at me across that dinner table," Shaq said, his voice gaining warmth even as it remained thick with emotion, and said, "Shaq, that 16-year-old kid who everyone said was too small, too weak, too unlikely to succeed, just finished his third NBA championship. But you know what I'm most proud of? Not the rings, not the records, not the recognition. I'm most proud that he never stopped believing in himself, even when the world gave him every reason to quit. I'm proud that he became living proof that dreams don't have size requirements." Daniel Patel, the sports journalist watching from his home in Miami, felt tears streaming down his face as he thought about his own children and the dreams they shared with such enthusiasm, dreams that he sometimes met with cautious realism instead of the kind of unwavering support that Dell had shown Steph. In 20 years of covering professional athletics, he had never heard a story that so perfectly captured the intersection of sports, family, and the transformative power of the human spirit. And then, Dell said the words that changed absolutely everything for me, Shaq said, his voice now barely above a whisper but carrying more power than any stadium full of cheering fans. He said, "Shaq, every child in this world needs someone who believes in their impossible dream. Every child needs someone who sees their greatness. Before they do, someone who refuses to let them give up on themselves when times get difficult. And if you're blessed enough to be that person for someone, you have the power to change not just their life, but potentially the entire world." The studio had become completely silent, except for the sound of Shaq's emotional breathing, and the quiet tears of crew members who understood they had just witnessed something that transcended television production, something that touched the very essence of what it means to love another human being without conditions or limitations. "That's when I realized," Shaq said, looking directly into the camera as if speaking personally to every parent who would eventually watch this interview, "that Dell Curry didn't just raise a basketball player who happened to be successful. He raised a human being who believes in the impossible because someone taught him that impossible is just another word for not yet. He raised someone who changes the world because someone first changed his understanding of what was possible." The weight of that revelation settled over everyone in the studio like a blessing, like a challenge, like a call to action that would echo through homes and hearts long after the interview ended. Dell Curry's approach to fatherhood had become a template, a standard, a reminder of what becomes possible when love meets unwavering belief and refuses to accept defeat. Powerful truths require courage to be spoken. But sometimes, the most powerful truths are the ones that remind us of our own capacity to be the believing voice that transforms someone's entire understanding of what their life could become, simply by refusing to let them give up on themselves when giving up seems like the only reasonable option. The silence that followed Shaq's retelling of Dell's words seemed to stretch across the studio like a bridge connecting past and present, connecting the story of a father's unwavering belief in his son with something much more personal and transformative happening in real time. You could see the exact moment when Shaq realized that Dell's story wasn't just about Steph Curry and his journey to basketball greatness. It was about every father, every parent, every person who had ever been in a position to either build someone up or allow them to fall, to either nurture dreams or inadvertently crush them under the weight of well-intentioned but limiting advice. James Wilson watched with the trained eye of someone who had spent 25 years recognizing the signs of profound personal transformation. Shaq's massive shoulders began to shake slightly, like a mountain experiencing the first tremors of an earthquake that would reshape its entire landscape, alter its very foundation, and create new peaks where none had existed before. After Dell finished telling me that story, Shaq said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that seemed to make him appear both smaller and somehow larger at the same time, I sat there in that banquet hall in Charlotte, surrounded by hundreds of people celebrating and laughing and enjoying themselves, and I felt completely alone with my own thoughts, my own memories, my own growing realization that I had been missing something fundamental about what it really means to be a father. You can sense that sometimes the most profound revelations come not from what we learn about others, but from what we discover about ourselves when we see our own reflection in the mirror of someone else's truth. Shaq's eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if he were looking back through years of his own parenting, examining conversations he'd had with his children, words he'd spoken, opportunities he might have missed to be the kind of believing voice that Dell had been for Steph. Robert Kim, the veteran producer, motioned silently to his camera operators with the subtle expertise of someone who had spent 4 decades recognizing moments that required the most careful and respectful handling. He understood that they were about to document not just an interview, but a confession, a transformation. A man courageously examining his own soul in front of millions of people who would soon be doing the same thing in their own homes and hearts. Dell kept talking, Shaq continued, his voice growing more introspective with each word, telling me more stories about Steph's journey, about the doubt he faced at every level, about the coaches who overlooked him, about the scouts who dismissed him. But honestly, I wasn't really hearing those stories anymore. I was hearing echoes of conversations I'd had with my own children, words I'd spoken that suddenly felt heavy in my memory, inadequate, maybe even harmful without me ever realizing it. Anthony Jong adjusted his camera position to capture the full range of emotions playing across Shaq's face, recognizing with the instinct of someone who had spent 30 years behind the lens that they were witnessing someone cross a line from storytelling into personal transformation. The technical aspects of filming seemed to fade into the background, as everyone in the studio became witnesses to something much more significant than television production. "See, here's what Dell's story made me realize about myself," Shaq said, his voice gaining strength even as it remained thick with emotion, carrying the weight of self-examination and hard-won wisdom. "I thought I was being a good father to my children. I provided for them financially. I showed up to their games and school events. I told them I loved them. But I realized that night in Charlotte that I had never done what Dell did for Steph. I had never looked my children in the eyes and promised them that I would believe in their impossible dreams." How many parents across America were about to recognize themselves in Shaq's confession? How many mothers and fathers think they're doing enough by simply being present, by providing the basics, by showing up physically without truly showing up emotionally, without becoming the unwavering source of belief that their children desperately need when the world seems determined to convince them their dreams are unrealistic? Tyler Brooks, the young production assistant, felt his throat tighten with recognition as he thought about his own father, about conversations they'd never had, about encouragement that had never come, about dreams that had withered, not from lack of talent or opportunity, but from lack of someone who believed they were worth pursuing. The universal nature of what Shaq was sharing made the studio feel like a confessional where everyone present was examining their own relationships, their own missed opportunities to be someone's believing voice. I started thinking about specific conversations with my kids, Shaq continued, his massive hands now openly trembling as he spoke. Times when they came to me excited about something they wanted to try, something they wanted to achieve, some dream they wanted to chase. And I realized with growing horror that too often my first instinct was to be what I thought was realistic, to point out the challenges, the odds against success, the reasons why it might not work out the way they hoped. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to burn, carrying with it the acrid scent of regret and the potential for redemption. Wilson could see that Shaq was not just telling a story anymore. He was conducting a public examination of his own soul, courageously sharing his shortcomings in a way that would give millions of other parents permission to examine their own approaches to nurturing their children's dreams. Dell made me realize that I had been teaching my children to manage their expectations instead of expanding their possibilities, Shaq said, and the words seemed to cut through him as he spoke them, each syllable carrying the weight of years of misguided but well-intentioned parenting. I thought I was protecting them from disappointment, preparing them for the real world, helping them develop realistic goals. But what I was really doing was limiting their dreams before they even had a chance to chase them, before they could discover what they were truly capable of achieving. Connor Smith, watching from his apartment in New York, paused everything he was doing as Shaq's words hit him like a physical force. This wasn't just a basketball story anymore. This was a mirror being held up to every parent who had ever chosen practical over possible, who had ever confused realism with limitation, who had ever forgotten that children need believers more than they need protectors from failure, more than they need managers of their expectations. That night in Charlotte changed everything about how I understood my role as a father, Shaq continued, his voice breaking slightly as he relived the moment of realization that had reshaped his entire approach to parenting. I called my oldest son when I got back to my hotel room. It was almost midnight, but I couldn't wait until morning. I needed to have a conversation that was about 3 years overdue, a conversation that should have happened long before that night. You could feel the emotional weight of that phone call settling over everyone in the studio like a heavy blanket. What do you say to your child when you realize you've been parenting from fear instead of faith? How do you undo years of well-intentioned but potentially limiting advice? How do you rebuild trust with someone whose dreams you might have inadvertently discouraged? I told him about my conversation with Dell, Shaq said, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks like rivers carving new paths through stone, creating permanent changes in the landscape of his face and his heart. And then I did something I had never done before in my entire life as a father. I asked my son to forgive me for not believing in his dreams, the way Dell believed in Steph's. I apologized for being a dream manager instead of a dream amplifier. Ryan Johnson, the audio engineer, made subtle adjustments to capture every nuance of Shaq's emotional delivery, understanding that these weren't just words being recorded for later broadcast. They were becoming part of a confession that would inspire parents across the country to have similar difficult but necessary conversations with their own children. My son was quiet for what felt like an eternity, Shaq said, his voice barely above a whisper as he shared this most vulnerable moment. And then he said something that simultaneously broke my heart and put it back together in a completely new configuration. He said, "Dad, I stopped sharing my big dreams with you a long time ago because I was afraid you'd give me all the reasons they wouldn't work, instead of helping me figure out how they could work." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the recognition that this conversation was happening in countless homes across America, that Shaq's experience was not unique but universal, that millions of children had learned to keep their biggest dreams to themselves because the adults in their lives had become obstacle identifiers instead of possibility creators. That's when I realized the full magnitude of what Dell Curry had accomplished, Shaq said, looking directly into the camera with an intensity that seemed to reach through the screen and grab every viewer by the heart. Dell hadn't just raised Steph to be a great basketball player who happened to win championships and break records. He had raised him to be someone who believes that impossible is just another word for not yet. Someone who approaches every challenge with the unshakable confidence that comes from having at least one person who believes in you completely. Daniel Patel, watching from Miami, felt tears streaming down his face as he thought about his own 8-year-old daughter and the dreams she shared with wide-eyed excitement that he too often met with cautious realism instead of enthusiastic support. He thought about all the times he had inadvertently taught her to lower her expectations instead of raising her possibilities. All the opportunities he had missed to be her Dell Curry. Dell taught me that night that our job as parents isn't to prepare our children for the world as it currently exists, Shaq continued, his voice gaining power and conviction with each word. Our job is to prepare them to change the world into what it could become. Our job is to be the voice that says, "Yes, you can," so consistently and so powerfully that it becomes louder than all the voices that say, "No, you can't." The transformation in Shaq was visible to everyone in the studio, and would soon be visible to millions of viewers. The man who had started this interview as someone sharing a story about Dell Curry had evolved into someone sharing a revelation about the power of unconditional belief, about the sacred responsibility that comes with being someone's anchor when the storms of doubt threaten to destroy their dreams. I spent the next 6 months having the most important conversations of my life, Shaq said, his voice now carrying a quality of profound gratitude mixed with determined purpose. Conversations with all my children where I asked them about dreams they had stopped sharing, about goals they had abandoned, about possibilities they had given up on, because they thought I wouldn't support them or believe they were achievable. Christopher Lee, a sports analyst watching from Boston, felt compelled to pause the interview and immediately call his own teenage son. There was something about Shaq's vulnerability, something about the raw honesty of his confession, that made him realize how many opportunities he had missed to be a believing voice in his child's life. How many times he had chosen practicality over possibility. "And you know what I discovered during those 6 months of conversations?" Shaq asked, his face lighting up with a mixture of joy, wonder, and profound relief. My children had never stopped dreaming those impossible dreams. They had just stopped sharing them with me because they had learned that I was more likely to point out obstacles than to help them overcome those obstacles. They had never lost their capacity for big dreams. They had just learned to keep those dreams private. The studio had become a sacred space where truth was being spoken with the kind of courage that changes lives, where vulnerability was being offered as a gift to millions of parents who would soon be examining their own relationships with their children, their own approaches to nurturing or inadvertently limiting the dreams that could change the world. But when I became the kind of father Dell was to Steph, Shaq continued, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom, When I became someone who believes in impossible dreams instead of someone who points out why they might not work, my children started dreaming out loud again. They started sharing their biggest hopes, their wildest possibilities, their most ambitious goals, because they knew I would be their believing voice instead of their cautionary voice. You can sense that sometimes the most important changes in our lives come not from learning new information, but from seeing familiar things through completely different eyes, from understanding that our role in other people's lives is not to manage their expectations, but to expand their sense of what's possible when someone believes in them unconditionally. Dell Curry taught me that the greatest gift you can give another human being isn't success, isn't money, isn't even love in the abstract, Shaq said, his voice now carrying the finality of deep conviction. The greatest gift you can give someone is the unshakable belief that they are capable of achieving anything they're willing to work for, anything they're willing to dream, anything they're willing to pursue, with the kind of determination that only comes from knowing that at least one person sees their greatness, even when they can't see it themselves. How is it possible that a conversation between two fathers at a charity dinner could have such profound ripple effects, could create such transformation, could inspire such fundamental changes in how someone approaches the most important relationships in their life? But there was Shaq, this giant of a man who had dominated basketball courts around the world, explaining how Dell Curry's parenting philosophy had not just changed his approach to fatherhood, but his entire understanding of what it means to believe in another human being's unlimited potential. That night in Charlotte changed everything for me, Shaq concluded, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose life had been fundamentally altered by another person's truth. But what Dell said to me at the very end of our conversation, those final words that he shared before we parted ways, that's what I'll carry with me for the rest of my life, and that's what I hope will change how everyone listening thinks about their own capacity to be someone's believing voice. Powerful truths require courage to be spoken. But sometimes the most powerful truth of all is the one that teaches us we have the power to be someone else's miracle, someone else's source of unshakable belief, someone else's proof that impossible dreams can become inevitable realities when they're supported by unconditional love and unwavering faith in human potential. The weight of anticipation in the studio had become almost physical, pressing down on everyone present like the atmosphere before a storm that will change the landscape forever. You could see in Shaq's eyes that he was approaching the moment that had haunted him for 3 years, the moment when Dell Curry had spoken words so profound, so transformative, so universally applicable that they had rewritten Shaq's entire understanding of what it means to be a father, a mentor, a believer in human potential, and a guardian of dreams that might seem impossible but are actually inevitable when supported by the right kind of love. James Wilson leaned forward slightly, recognizing with the instinct of someone who had spent his quarter-century career conducting interviews that they were approaching the emotional crescendo of something extraordinary, something that would be quoted and remembered and shared long after everything else from this conversation had faded from memory. The very air in the studio seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for words that would soon echo through living rooms and hearts across the nation and around the world. The late afternoon light streaming through the studio windows had taken on a golden quality that seemed to sanctify the space, as if the universe itself was preparing for words that would touch, something sacred in the human experience, something that transcends sports and speaks directly to the fundamental question of how we love and support and believe in the people who matter most to us. Dell looked at me across that dinner table in Charlotte, Shaq began, his voice carrying a weight that made every word sound like it was being carved into stone, like it was being etched into the permanent record of human wisdom. And I could see in his eyes that he had something more to say. Something that went beyond Steph's individual story, beyond basketball achievements, beyond anything I thought I was prepared to hear or understand. You can feel that the most powerful moments in life often arrive unexpectedly, in the quiet spaces between stories, in the pauses between heartbeats, in the moments when someone decides to trust you with their deepest truth, their most hard-earned wisdom, their most transformative insight into what it really means to love another human being without conditions or limitations. Robert Kim, the veteran producer, signaled to his team with the subtle hand gestures of someone who had spent 40 years recognizing historic moments. He knew they were documenting something that would be replayed in homes across the country, something that would be shared at family dinners and graduation ceremonies, something that would become part of the permanent conversation about what it means to be a parent who changes lives instead of limiting them. Dell reached across the table, Shaq continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, creating an intimacy that would make millions of future viewers feel like they were part of that private conversation 3 years ago. And he put his hand on my arm with the gentleness of someone who understood the weight of what he was about to share. And he said, "Shaq, can I tell you something that I've never told anyone else before? Something about that night when Steph was 16 and ready to give up on his dreams?" The silence that followed was different from any other silence in that studio. It was the kind of silence that precedes life-changing revelations, the kind that makes you realize you're about to hear something that will fundamentally alter your understanding of what's possible when one human being refuses to let another human being give up on themselves, regardless of how many times the world has told them their dreams are unrealistic. Anthony Jang adjusted his camera, angled to capture the tears that were already beginning to form in Shaq's eyes, understanding with the instinct of someone who had spent 30 years documenting the full spectrum of human emotion that sometimes the most powerful stories are told not just through words, but through the raw vulnerability of people brave enough to share their deepest truths with millions of strangers. "Dell looked me straight in the eyes," Shaq said, his voice beginning to break with the weight of the memory. "And he said something that I replay in my mind every single day. He said, 'Shaq, that night when Steph came home crying, when he wanted to quit basketball forever, when everyone had convinced him he wasn't good enough, that wasn't the first time he'd had that conversation with me about giving up. It was the 7th time.'" Tyler Brooks felt his breath catch in his throat as the magnitude of that revelation hit him. 7 times. 7 different occasions when Steph Curry, the future 3-time NBA champion and revolutionary basketball player, had been ready to abandon his dreams. 7 moments when the future seemed impossible, when doubt had overwhelmed hope, when a young man needed someone to believe in him more than he believed in himself. "Dell told me," Shaq continued, tears now flowing freely down his face. He said, 6 times before that 7th night, Steph had come to me completely defeated. 6 different times. Coaches had rejected him, scouts had overlooked him, people had told him he wasn't built for this game, that he should focus on something more realistic, something more suited to his physical limitations. And 6 times, I had to find new ways to help him believe in himself again, new words to rebuild his confidence, new strategies to help him see past the temporary setbacks to the permanent possibilities. How many parents would have eventually started to doubt their own judgment? How many fathers would have begun to wonder if maybe the coaches and scouts were right after the 3rd rejection, the 4th disappointment, the fifth crushing blow to their child's dreams. But Dell Curry had found the emotional and spiritual strength to believe 7 different times, to rebuild hope 7 different times, to refuse to let his son's dreams die 7 different times. Connor Smith, watching from his apartment in New York, felt overwhelmed by the mathematical beauty and profound commitment that those numbers represented. 7 opportunities for a father to say, maybe they're right. 7 chances to choose practicality over possibility. 7 moments when Dell Curry could have protected his son from further disappointment by encouraging him to lower his expectations. But instead, 7 times he had chosen to be the believing voice that refused to accept defeat. But then, Dell said something that completely destroyed me, Shaq said, his voice now openly sobbing with the weight of a revelation that had been changing his life for 3 years. He said, "Shaq, do you know what I realized on that 7th night, when Steph was 16 and broken again, when he was ready to give up for what could have been the final time? I realized that my job wasn't to help him believe in himself 7 times. My job was to believe in him enough for both of us, every single time, until he was strong enough to carry that belief entirely on his own." The profundity of that statement settled over the studio like a blessing, like a challenge, like a complete redefinition of what parental love could accomplish when it refused to accept limitations as permanent conditions. Wilson could see that everyone present was processing not just Shaq's story, but their own relationships, their own opportunities to be someone's unwavering source of belief. Dell looked at me with tears forming in his own eyes, Shaq continued, his voice carrying the reverence of someone sharing sacred wisdom. And he said something that I think about every time I talk to my own children now. He said, "The world gave Steph 7 opportunities to quit on his dreams. I gave him 7 reasons to keep believing. And you know what happened? That 7th conversation, that 7th time I refused to let him give up. That was the last time he ever doubted himself. That 7th rebuilding of his confidence was the one that finally took permanent hold." The mathematical beauty of that revelation hit everyone in the studio like a wave of understanding. 7 moments of doubt met, with 7 moments of unwavering belief. 7 opportunities to surrender, matched by 7 refusals to accept defeat. 7 tests of a father's faith that had resulted in one of the most revolutionary basketball players in history. Someone who had literally changed how the game was played and understood. But then, Dell said the words that changed my entire life forever, Shaq said, looking directly into the camera with an intensity that seemed to reach through the screen and grab every viewer by the heart, speaking to parents and children and anyone who had ever needed someone to believe in their seemingly impossible dreams. He said, "Shaq, Steph's ultimate success isn't really about basketball talent or athletic achievement. It's about what becomes possible when someone absolutely refuses to let you give up on yourself. It's about what happens when you have one person who believes in your impossible dream more consistently and more powerfully than you believe in your own limitations." Ryan Johnson, the audio engineer, made micro-adjustments to ensure every word of this life-changing confession was captured with perfect clarity. He understood that these weren't just words being recorded for a television program. They were becoming part of a legacy that would inspire parents and children for decades to come. Words that would be quoted at family gatherings and shared in moments when someone needed to be reminded of their own unlimited potential. Dell leaned even closer to me, Shaq continued, his massive frame shaking with the emotion of reliving this transformative conversation. And he said something that I carry with me every single day. He said, "Every child in this world deserves to have someone who will believe in them 7 times, 70 times, 700 times, if that's what it takes. Every child deserves to have someone who sees their greatness even when they can't see it themselves. Someone who refuses to let temporary setbacks become permanent limitations." Daniel Patel, watching from his home in Miami, felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what fatherhood could be, what parental love could accomplish, what kind of impact one person's unwavering belief could have on another person's entire life trajectory. This wasn't just about supporting your children through difficult times. This was about becoming their anchor of possibility when the storms of doubt threatened to sink their dreams entirely. And then, Dell said the words that I think about every single morning when I wake up, Shaq said, his voice carrying a reverence that made the studio feel like a cathedral where profound truths were being shared. He said, "Shaq, the greatest tragedy in the world isn't that some people fail to achieve their dreams despite their best efforts. The greatest tragedy is that some people never get to chase their dreams at all, because no one ever believed those dreams were worth chasing, because no one ever saw the greatness that was waiting to be unlocked." How is it possible that words spoken across a dinner table could carry such transformative power, could create such fundamental changes in how someone approaches every relationship in their life? But there was Shaq, this giant of a man who had dominated everything he'd ever attempted, explaining how Dell Curry's philosophy had not just changed his parenting approach, but his entire understanding of what it means to see and nurture and believe in human potential. "Dell looked me in the eyes one final time," Shaq said, his voice now carrying the weight of someone delivering the most important message of their entire life. "And he said something that I hope will change how everyone listening thinks about their own capacity to be someone's believing voice. He said, 'Shaq, we don't just raise our individual children when we choose to believe in their impossible dreams. We raise the next generation of believers. We raise the people who will believe in their children and their children's children. Every time we choose to see greatness instead of limitations, we're not just changing one life, we're changing the future of human possibility.'" The studio had become completely silent, except for the sound of Shaq's emotional breathing and the quiet tears of crew members who understood they had just witnessed something that transcended television production, something that touched the very essence of what it means to love another human, being without conditions, without limitations, without the need for immediate evidence that our belief is justified. "That night in Charlotte," Shaq said, his voice growing stronger despite the tears, carrying the conviction of someone whose life had been fundamentally altered by another person's wisdom, "Dell Curry taught me that being a father isn't about preparing your children for the world as it currently exists. It's about raising them to create the world as it should become. It's about being the voice that says, 'Yes, you can,' so consistently and so powerfully that it becomes louder than all the voices that say, 'No, you can't.'" Christopher Lee, watching from his study in Boston, immediately reached for his phone to call his son. There was something about Shaq's testimony, something about the raw authenticity of his transformation, that made him realize how many opportunities he had missed to be a believing voice, how many dreams he had accidentally discouraged by trying to be realistic instead of supportive, by trying to manage expectations instead of expanding possibilities. Dell made me understand something profound about Steph's 3 championships, his revolutionary impact on basketball, his ability to make impossible shots look routine, Shaq continued, his voice carrying deep gratitude and wonder. All of that greatness, all of those achievements that changed how we think about what's possible in basketball, all of that started with a father who refused to let his son quit on himself 7 different times. All of that historic success was built on a foundation of someone who believed in an impossible dream, when believing was the hardest and most important thing in the world to do. The transformation in Shaq was complete and visible to everyone in the studio, and would soon be visible to millions of viewers around the world. The man who had started this interview sharing someone else's story had become someone sharing a revelation about the sacred responsibility that comes with being someone's anchor when the storms of doubt threaten to destroy the dreams that could change everything. Since that night 3 years ago, Shaq said, his voice now carrying profound gratitude mixed with determined purpose, I've tried every single day to be for my children what Dell was for Steph. I've tried to be the voice that believes in their impossible dreams, the person who sees their unlimited potential even when they can't see it themselves. The father who refuses to let temporary setbacks become permanent limitations on what they believe is possible for their lives. You can sense that sometimes the most important conversations happen not in boardrooms or classrooms or conference halls, but across dinner tables between two parents who understand that raising children is really about raising believers, dreamers, and people who refuse to accept the word impossible as anything more than a temporary condition that can be overcome with enough dedication, support, and unwavering belief. Dell Curry didn't just raise Steph to be a great basketball player who happened to win championships and break records, Shaq concluded, his voice carrying a finality that suggested the most important truth of all was being delivered. He raised him to be living, breathing proof that impossible is just another word for not yet, that dreams don't have size requirements or physical limitations, and that having one person who believes in you completely and consistently can literally change not just your own life, but the entire world around you. The silence that followed was profound and sacred, filled with the recognition that everyone present had witnessed something extraordinary, not just the retelling of a conversation, but the transmission of a philosophy that could transform how people think about parenting, about believing in others, about the power of unconditional support to create miracles that seemed impossible until someone refused to accept that impossibility as permanent. Every time I see Steph Curry make one of those impossible shots from 40 feet away, Shaq said, looking directly into the camera one final time, with the intensity of someone delivering a message that could change lives, I don't just see a great basketball player doing something amazing. I see what happens when a father refuses to let his son give up on himself 7 different times. I see the power of believing in someone's impossible dream until they're strong enough to believe in it themselves. I see proof that one person's unwavering faith can create ripple effects that change the world. James Wilson realized that what had started as an interview about a conversation between two fathers had become something much more significant, a masterclass in unconditional love, a testimony to the transformative power of unwavering belief, and a challenge to every parent, teacher, mentor, and human being watching to become the kind of person Dell Curry had been for Steph. That's Dell Curry's real legacy, Shaq concluded, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had been fundamentally changed by another person's truth and wanted to share that transformation with the world. Not just raising a son who became a great basketball player, but showing all of us what becomes possible when someone refuses to let you quit on your dreams, no matter how many times the world tells you those dreams are unrealistic. No matter how many obstacles seem to stand in your way, no matter how impossible the journey ahead might appear. The camera captured one final image of Shaq wiping tears from his eyes, his massive frame somehow made even more impressive by his willingness to be completely vulnerable, to share his own shortcomings, and to honor another father's approach to raising a child who would change the world simply by refusing to accept limitations as permanent conditions. Powerful truths require courage to be spoken. But the most powerful truth of all is that every single one of us has the capacity to be someone's Dell Curry, someone's believing voice, someone's unwavering source of faith when the storms of doubt threaten to destroy the dreams that could change not just individual lives, but the entire future of human possibility and achievement.